Welcome to Athar's Garage. In this video, I'll be working on the Schumacher LD3 stock spec, steps 1 through 6, which is the front and rear shocks. So let's get started. So I'm going to build just one shock for the front and one shock for the rear, and then I'll build the other one off camera or quickly so that way it doesn't take up too much time. All right, so let's open up bag 1. All right, so let's take a look. So we have our sprue with our pistons. It looks like we have 2 by 1.6 up to 2 by 2.1 holes. So for the fronts, it looks like we will be using bag A step 2. It says we're going to use the 1.6 2-hole pistons. So we have our front shock bodies nicely machined and anodized. One thing that I hate are the molded shock pistons. I feel like they should be machined. But let's get the 1.6 off the parts tree. We're also going to need these spacers that are on the parts tree here and here. So let's get those off as well and trimmed if necessary. All right, so we're going to go ahead and install our O-rings. So this large black O-ring is going to install over the bottom of the shock, and it's going to sit on the outside of the threads like so. Next, we're going to apply a little bit of grease, some O-ring grease, even though it doesn't say to, but never be too cautious here. I've never had any issues when using O-ring grease. So we're going to install one O-ring first. Then we're going to install the thick spacer. Then we're going to install another O-ring. Then we're going to install the other spacer with the smaller diameter facing outward like so. Now we can install the bottom shock cap. And I'm going to leave this kind of loose because I will tighten this after I install the shock shaft. All right, so now we can move on to step 2. So let's go ahead and open up bag number 2. All right, gonna clean up some flashing on the rod end. Use a provided blue thread locker that came in the kit. So in the grease and oils bag, there's a thread locker. So we're gonna take a shock shaft. We're gonna install our shock piston support, and take note how it installs because there's a little pocket or countersink in there. So that countersink sits on the shaft. So it sits on the shaft like so. It'll be flat on the top, and you'll see that countersink on the bottom. Next, we're going to install the piston. We're going to install it with the 1.6 facing up, and there's also a countersink hole. And lastly, we will install our M2.5 by 8 countersunk screw. So put a little bit of blue Loctite on there. You don't want to over tighten it because you can bend the shock piston. So now we can install the shock shaft through the shock body. I'm going to add a little bit of oil on the threads so that it slides through the O-rings nice and smooth. I'm going to rotate as I'm going through the O-rings. Right. Now I'm going to tighten up the bottom shock cap. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and install the rod end. Put a little bit of oil on the threads to help get the rod end threaded. I'm going to leave 22 millimeters of travel. All right, we're at 22. Now we can go ahead and install our rod end ball, and does not look directional, so we can go ahead and install it. Okay, so that's it for step 2. Piston moves nice and free, doesn't seem like there's any excessive friction or anything like that. I would probably highly recommend getting machined pistons. I think that's probably what I'll do, just because I don't really like molded pistons. I feel like they're a little inconsistent. So now we can move on to step 3, which is actually going to be filling up the shock and then getting the rest of the shock cap and collar ready to install. So in the front, we're going to install a 550 CST shock fluid. So I wish it was like the other kit bottles where there's like a little spout, but this is just a bottle. So we're going to fill it up almost to the top, and then I'll stroke the shock a few times to get the air bubbles underneath the piston out, and then we will let this sit for some time. Pretty thick fluid. While I'm stroking the shock, I'm actually rotating the shaft so that it'll help get more air bubbles out from underneath the piston. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and assemble the other shock real quick, and then we'll move on to the rear shocks, and that way step 3 and step 6 are going to be very similar, so we can kind of skip and do that while we're waiting for the air to come out of the fluid. All right, let's move on to the rear shocks. It's going to start in bag 4 or step 4. All right, so for the rear shocks, we're going to be using the 1.8 piston, which is going to be this one right here. And then we're also going to need the spacers for the O-rings. So let's get everything off the parts tree. All right, so the same thing for the rear shocks. We're gonna install the black O-ring over the bottom threads. And it'll just sit like so. Next, we're going to install our O-rings and spacers. Remember, the bottom spacer is going to sit like so. You see that it has, it's like a little hat. So the smaller diameter will be facing outward. And then we can lightly screw on our bottom cap. Now we can open up bag 5 or step 5. So again, we're going to install our shock piston support with the countersink facing the shock shaft. So it's going to look like so when you install it. Then we're going to install the countersink on the shock piston onto that support. And then we'll screw on our M2.5 screw with a little bit of blue thread lock. Don't forget the thread lock, because I've seen these come undone during a race and ruin someone's day. So add a little bit of oil to the threads, and then we'll rotate it through the O-rings. All right. It does not move smoothly. So I'm going to take it out and sand the piston. All right, so I'm going to just chuck up the shock shaft in the drill and then let it rotate while I sand the outside. I feel like it's just a little bit too big, and this is the only way I can think of that'll sand it pretty evenly. I think it's a little out of round, so we'll try this. I use very light pressure to sand, so I didn't take off too much material. Moves nice and smooth and free, so we'll continue. So now we need to install the rod end, and we want to have 28.5 of stroke. So for the rear shock, we're going to use 400 CST oil. So let's go ahead and put that in. And then stroke the shaft to get the air bubbles from underneath the piston out. Do that a few times, and then we'll set this aside to let the air bubbles out. The damping seems pretty high, or the fluid seems pretty high compared to the Associated or X-Ray buggy out of the box. So we'll see how it works out for us. So the piston still doesn't move freely in this shock body, so I'm gonna have to do the same thing. That's why I think machined pistons are highly necessary in all kits just because it's going to provide a little bit more consistent shock. All right, so it's been about 15 minutes. Most of the air bubbles are out. So I'm going to set this aside for now, and we're going to prepare the shock caps. One of the things that I dislike about Schumacher builds is that their shock caps are not ready to install. You got to drill holes in them for the bleeder screw. So you can open up bags 3 and 6 and then do all the shock caps at one time. The hardware and everything for the front and rear are the same. The only thing that's different are the springs. I'm going to go ahead and get the springs ready. The way that they mark their springs are with a little piece of heat shrink. So these are the rear springs, they're green. So it comes with a little piece of heat shrink that you put on the coils. And I've seen some people actually heat shrink these on. Others I see that they just leave it on there, kind of loose, like so. That's up to you. So I'm just going to leave it like that. The rear springs are ready. Let's go ahead and get the front springs ready. The front springs are black. At the track I'm at, we're about to move, so I don't know. I'm sure the spring setup's going to change, but most of the fast guys are running, I think, orange in the front and black in the rear. All right, so we can go ahead and get our shock collars ready, and we're going to use the larger O-ring. There's 2 O-rings that were in that bag, so we're going to use the larger one to put on the shock collars. So there's a little groove on the inside, and you just pop that O-ring right in there, and then you can put a little bit of oil on there, some shock fluid or oil, to help lubricate it, and it will help making the adjustments a lot easier. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and carefully thread these on to the shock bodies. You're going to install it in this orientation. The knurled portion where you grip it is going to face the top. And I'm just going to thread these all the way up. It doesn't give a initial setting gap. You're gonna have to, that's gonna change depending on the weight of your car, electronics, all that stuff. So I'm just gonna take it all the way up, and then I'll adjust it once I do my initial setup. So I'll do this to all the shocks, and then we will continue. All right, so this is the part that I really hate about Schumacher builds. The shock cap doesn't have holes in it. You have to drill them yourself. So you need a 1mm to 1.9mm drill bit. I'm going to use a 1/16 of an inch drill bit for those of you that do not use the metric system. And then you want to drill, these are both facing the front this way. I'm going to drill one from this side and one from this side for the front, and then also one this side and one on this side for the rear. So that way they're facing the correct direction. I'm going to just clean up some of the shavings or burrs that were created. So now we're going to install the O-ring in the cap, just like so. Let's do that to all of them, making sure there's no debris or anything like that. All right, so now we're ready to pretty much bleed the shocks. One thing I'm going to do before we do that is I'm just going to take the bleeder screw and pre-thread some of these holes. So that way, just a few turns. That way when we do install it, we're not struggling. Let's start with the front shocks. We're going to go ahead and fill them up. I'm going to fill it up to the top, almost overflowing. And then we're going to add some in the shock cap. Then we're going to go ahead and thread this on. And I have a microfiber towel ready because it will get messy. Okay, all the way tight, nice and snug. And then we're going to take our pinky and compress the shock and wipe any excess that's coming out. We're going to do that very slowly. Okay, now we're going to put in our bleeder screw. And you just have to kind of snug it up. Once you feel it snug up, it's good. You don't want to over tighten it because it is plastic. Just clean up that shock as best as you can. And now you can compress it about 20 times. And then leave it compressed. And that's a dead shock. That's exactly what you want. Now if it comes out a bit more, I would open it up, let the more air escape. That means that you've got too much air in there. So that's the front shock. We can add our spring and pop on our spring perch on the bottom. It's going to install like so. I like the design of the spring perch because it kind of forces that spring to stick on there. And these are hard to lose. So there we go. That's the front shock. Now we're going to do the same thing for the rest of the shocks. We'll do the same thing for the rear shocks. Just fill them up, put a little bit in the cap, and then do the bleeding procedure. All right, so all the shocks are built. So things to take away from these steps, I would probably just do steps 1, 2, 4, and 5, and then save steps 3 and 6 to the end. That way you can do step 3 and 6 while the shocks are kind of bleeding or getting some of the air out. You need a drill bit, which sucks, to open up the bleeder hole in the shock cap. The other thing that I'm not a fan of are the molded shock pistons. You saw that when I tried to put the 2x1.8 in the rear, there's too much friction between the piston and the shock body, so I had to take the drill out and sand some material off. I did very light pressure and I was able to get it to move nice and smooth. Definitely recommend getting some machined pistons. I'll take a look and see what I can find on the market. Maybe the associated pistons fit since they're the same size. But that's pretty much my experience for steps 1 through 6. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and found it helpful. Please like and subscribe if you did. Let me know down in the comments if you had any issues or tips for the community. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one.